I hear a lot of like, I'm living an inauthentic life. Like where I am saying how
Mm.
I got here were not actually what I wanted for myself. A lot of the choices I've made that have led me to this moment were made to please other people.
Have you ever caught yourself in a pattern of doing something for someone and then you find yourself feeling burnt out or full of resentment? One of the things I've had to confront throughout my growth journey is this pattern and the inclination to people please. In this episode, I got to talk to a mental health counselor and anxiety treatment specialist, Justine Carino, all about people pleasing and these patterns that lead to burnout and resentment. Justine helps us understand what people pleasing is and why we do it, and how we can tap into our core values to establish boundaries and step out of these people pleasing patterns and into our strength.
Everybody's learning. Everybody's growing. Everybody's got to start somewhere. How the wise one grows.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to How the Wise One Grows. Before we get started, let's take a moment to land here together with 3 deep breaths. So just take a moment to notice where your body connects to the earth. You can gently soften your shoulders down your back. If it feels safe, you can rest your eyes. And notice where in the body you feel the inhale. And then notice where you feel the exhale. 2 more like this, noticing the in-breath. Notice the out-breath. 1 more, inhale. And exhale. Then return to where your body makes contact to the earth, and you can slowly open your eyes as you return to this space. So thank you so much for landing here with us. Today I am with Justine Carino. Did I say your name right? I meant to ask
Yes,
that.
you did. Yes.
Justine. I'm really excited to be with Justine today. Justine is a therapist, and we are going to talk about something that I have struggled with my whole life, which is people pleasing. So, Justine, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Holly. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be talking to you and your listeners and to be talking about one of my favorite topics that I am always talking about. I think so many people need to hear about this.
I definitely agree. I kind of just want to dive in because I feel like there's just so much to this topic that's really relatable for I I think a lot of people. Do you mind just kind of leaning into sharing with us what people pleasing is? Because it's definitely a word people know, but what does it actually mean?
Sure. So, the way we can view people pleasing is really our tendency to put in a lot of effort to make sure our actions and choices will be pleasing to other people. And this can be a subconscious way for us to try and guarantee a sense of security or acceptance or love from the people around us.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to normalize this, right? I think people pleasing kind of feels good, right? And there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of benefit to it. And actually, we're kind of wired that way. Like, if we think about us being cave people or cave women back at the start of time, there was a lot of risk to not getting along with other people, right? So, from what we know, is like the women were together in like communities, right? And we learned from each other, right? We kind of gather and socialize. Well, the
Mm-hmm.
the males were the ones out hunting and providing and bringing back the food, right? So as females back in time, there's a lot of benefit to forming community around us, and that's kind of how we learned and exchanged information. Like I'm sitting around a campfire, like How'd you cook your chicken today? Oh, don't eat
Mhm.
those berries. Oh, this is great fur to keep your babies warm. Like, we needed to socialize and be accepted for survival reasons. Like the
Mhm.
people that were alone probably didn't survive, right? But the people that learned how to make relationships and connections and a sense of community did. So if we look at people pleasing as a survival mechanism, if I could bring some happiness, joy, or please other people, we're likely to survive, which is so true if we even think of like babies today in 2023, like they want to please their caretakers because they're so dependent on their caretakers for survival. So making people happy is a survival skill. So people pleasing is a survival skill that we all have within us. So it's very normal. But when we have this conversation, I want to think of the excessive people pleasing, right? The people pleasing that we've become really dependent on and habitualized over time.
Yeah, I'm glad that you leaned into like people pleasing isn't inherently a bad thing. It's truly like a survival thing for all people because if you didn't have community, you couldn't survive. And I think a lot about how I mean, it still is survival today. Having community is so key, and especially on that emotional level in the world we face. The word belonging and like Brene Brown's work on belonging really comes to mind when we're talking about this right now.
For
But
sure.
when we,
For sure.
yeah. And when we think about that, I think of most things live on a spectrum, right? So there's like a spectrum where people pleasing can live, and it's like, yeah, that's how you belong and deal with community and can get along with people. But when we go to the other end of the spectrum that takes it to the extreme, and can become detrimental to our own well being, I think that's where there's some work and more conversation to be had around it. So when we
For
think about
sure.
that end, yeah. And when we think about that end of the spectrum, I guess first, let me rewind this. How do people know if they're a people pleaser? Like, I feel like for me, I'm like, I know I'm one, but is it something most people know or is it something you might not know?
Yeah. It's funny you bring that up. I remember, like, first of all, I identify as a people pleaser in recovery myself. But I
Mm-hmm.
remember like maybe learning the term at some point in like middle school and like, oh my goodness, that's me. Like it had to be pointed out to me. I remember this moment and I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah. So I wanted to learn all about it at the time. But like typical trait of someone that is a people pleaser is you say yes more than you really want to, right? You
Mm-hmm.
tend to avoid conflict. You focus a lot of your attention, energy, and efforts towards being liked by other people. It feels like the end of the world if someone doesn't like you.
Mm-hmm.
Being unliked is very uncomfortable. Um, Saying no also makes you uncomfortable or maybe even a little
Mm-hmm.
anxious. And it sometimes no comes with feelings of guilt that you struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
You often have too much on your plate or you feel resentful of all that you have to do or wish you could have said no. And you
Mm-hmm.
often hide your true feelings because you think it will make other people uncomfortable. If you really express what you're truly feeling, you're afraid you'll be rejected or make someone angry or have someone become disappointed with you.
Yeah. And why do you think that why do people fall into this pattern?
One of the biggest things that I talk about a lot with my clients is these people pleasing tendencies stemming from childhood family dynamic and going back to the
Mm-hmm.
survival mechanism inside all of us innately. Sometimes this is really necessary to survive in a certain family system. It keeps us feeling loved by the people around us.
Mm-hmm.
We say people pleasers were once parent pleasers. You know, they knew what to do to please their parents, right? Um, Also, like a fear of abandonment is there. Dynamics between parents and children can sometimes lead to this. Were you made to feel guilty if you did what pleased yourself over pleasing your parent or pleasing your
Mm-hmm.
sibling or pleasing what was good for the entire family system at the time? So I think this is developed slowly.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of benefit to those thoughts and behaviors in childhood that it then gets carried into adulthood. And adulthood is really the first time we recognize, like, maybe this type of being isn't so healthy for me.
Yeah.
And then we're resentful and like, why do I feel so resentful? But I think that a lot has to do with like early relationships in our life and how people pleasing benefited us.
Mhm. And I think about like within a family, when I think about like me and my siblings, I feel like we're all on a different place on that spectrum. So is it kind of more, it's not necessarily about like, I always find it interesting how each child can have a totally different experience in a family system.
Yeah,
So it's more like how you're situating yourself in that greater part of a whole versus just the way your parents like reared you and brought you up. Is that what you're saying?
exactly. Exactly. So we all take on a role in our family without anyone really knowing it, right? And so
Mhm.
these are subconscious roles that we kind of fall into based on our birth order, based on how we show up when shit goes down in our family,
Mhm.
based on like our own temperament and needs, right? And I'm thinking, I'm like, me and my brother, like, we're so opposite. Like, I'm more of a people pleaser. He's like, I'll do what I want, and I don't care how you feel about it, right? And like, he's so
Mhm.
assertive with what his needs are, where I was always more
Yeah.
passive. That was probably a great balance for my parents to have, right? We just fell into that. But these subconscious roles really keep the homeostasis of a system going.
Mm.
And so we kind of always play out these roles. And then when we head to adulthood, we then reenact these roles in other parts of our life. So yeah,
Okay.
there could be five siblings in a family, and everyone talk about their childhood in such different ways based on birth order and experiences at that time and the roles they filled that really benefited the overall good of the family, even if it was
Mhm.
dysfunctional.
From your experience, have you noticed a pattern in birth order and people pleasers?
Ooh, that's a great question. Um, Typically the firstborn is like it could go a few ways, but I would and I don't wanna, like, stereotype or generalize, but typically the firstborn really wants to please, like, they're the first and they, like the parents are it's like their guinea pig child, right? And they don't know what
Mhm.
they're doing, and the firstborn kind of plays into that and really wants to please them, where, like, the second or third child tends to be more of, like, the rebel. But
Mhm.
there's also situations where the people pleaser is the middle child because
That's me.
that's you, right. So then we have you're in the middle and the oldest is kind of just being the pioneer of the family, like the
Mhm.
first to drive, the first to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or the first to maybe come out to the family, right? The first to
Mhm.
do all of these things. And the other siblings kind of have to watch, oh, how's that going for that person? Do I need to, is that going
Mhm.
well for them? Right. And then if you're the middle child and you have someone younger than you, then there's like the baby. And the baby tends to get everything earlier than the rest. The baby tends to be like the princess or the prince of the family, and they have
Mhm.
their need. So the middle child is kind of cut in two of like, how do I make myself known? I'm having a hard time doing it. So I'll just be the peacemaker, or I'll just go with the flow. I'll shove my needs down. I'll please older sibling. I'll please younger sibling. I'll please the parents. Let me stay
Mhm.
quiet with why my need. Everyone else has all of these other.
Yes,
So I'd
I've
say the
so
middle
relate.
child too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's rough being a middle child.
Yeah.
My mom and I had like a going joke when I was growing up where I'd just be like, "What am I, chopped liver?" She like taught me to say that.
Yeah, that's really cute. I love that.
Yeah. So you mentioned a few things that I know I've experienced, particularly like burnout as a symptom, or not
Mhm.
burnout, particularly resentment as a
Yeah.
a symptom of people pleasing.
Yeah.
Are there any other kind of like side effects of people pleasing that you like people can be like, oh, maybe I am people pleasing more than I'm aware of? And do you notice any impacts of people pleasing on mental health and well being?
For sure. So I think some like side effects or symptoms is people And I love this question because people don't call me for therapy and they're like, hey, I want to come and work on my people pleasing trait. Like that has never
Mhm.
happened. But when they
Yeah.
get in my office, we learn that about them. But the things that they're
Mhm.
calling for is like, burnt out, right? Which we'll go into
Mm.
too. I'm stressed out all the time. I'm overwhelmed. I'm very frustrated with a relationship in my life. So it could be a relationship with a parent, a sibling, their own romantic relationship, their friend, their boss, or colleagues, right? There's some level of frustration that their needs aren't getting met and they don't know how to express them. They tend to shove
Mhm.
it down. And that's part of the people pleasing trait. They often say, like, I feel stuck or I feel really trapped in my situation. And realistically, the way to get out is probably to be more assertive, but they don't feel strong enough to do that. So they feel stuck
Mhm.
and trapped. Also, I hear a lot of like, I'm living an inauthentic life. Like where I am today and how
Mm.
I got here were not actually what I wanted for myself. A lot of the choices I've made that have led me to this moment were made to please other people, mom,
Mhm.
dad, mentors, peer group, society, right? So they're usually it's very pressured. Like I'm not living the life I want to live. I feel so inauthentic. So that would I
Yeah.
say would be some of those thoughts and feelings. But in terms of mental health, there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of burnout that comes with people pleasing.
Mm. Yeah, I definitely when I think back, like, as a child, I would kinda get to a point with friendships where I would just be like, "I can't hang out with that person anymore," because maybe we weren't, like, hanging out in a way that was supportive for me, but I didn't know how to communicate it, or if I didn't, I would just, like, ghost almost because I just didn't know how to be like, "I actually don't wanna do that today. Maybe we could do this instead."
Yeah, and so I love that. And that's like ghosting to avoid the possible confrontation that would need to
Mhm.
happen. That's interesting. It's like so compensatory to that.
Yeah. This is something that a listener sent in, which I was like, "Did you get inside my brain when you came up with this question?" But they asked, when we're thinking about people pleasing, how can we find a balance between making people happy, which, like, for a people pleaser, like, often I'm like, "That makes me happy." Like, yeah, if you're happy, I'm happy, versus over people pleasing. Like, how do we find the balance of when people pleasing is maybe, like, a healthy thing versus when it leans into that unhealthy place?
Like really doing too much for others. That's a great question. And I think it's like a constant assessment of your pattern, right? Your
Mm.
behaviors and how the choice makes you feel inside, right? Because I feel like it's little and big. A friend invites you to her 30th birthday party and you really don't want to go and you're dreading it, but you want to make the friend happy because you value
Mhm.
the friendship and you know there's a
Mhm.
benefit to doing. So we do have to please people sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes people expect that of us. And those are hard decisions to make because if you said no to everything everyone asks of you, then at some point we teeter on, are you being kind of selfish or are you
Yeah.
being kind, you know what I mean? Like we do have to accommodate other people's needs in our relationship. So it's a really a gray area. And I love the listeners' questions because we don't want to think of it as rigid. We want to think of these decisions as fluid. And I think a lot of it has to do with what you value, right? So if you value this friendship that I'm making up in my mind of your friend's 30th birthday, like, is this a friend that would do the same for you? Right? Would they
Mhm.
support you? Um, do you think you would feel good once you were there? Do you value the years, how many years you guys have been friends? And if you weren't going to the party, you would just be sitting and watching Netflix. Maybe you could push yourself out of that bubble, right? It would be different if it's like, "Ooh, it's my friend's 30th birthday, but I'm 9 months pregnant." Right? Then that's a different
Mhm.
conversation. Well, I kind of value my rest right now. I value getting my sleep, and I can imagine being out, and I need to express that to my friend. Even though this might disappoint that friend to hear me say I'd rather sleep, maybe it's a little bit more understandable, right? You're about to give birth next week. So I think we have to kind of check in with our values in those moments because our values do change over time. and we have to adapt to what we're valuing, what's a priority in our life. But it's a little bit of give and take because if we never please other people and just put our needs first all the time, then that's a troubled, tricky place to be in also. So we kind of have to constantly assess the balance. But it might
Mm.
be like another thing I'm thinking about as an example of burnout and people pleasing. Let's say you have a boss, and when you were hired, you were told the hours were 9 to 5, right? And then all of a sudden you're realizing 4 months in, it's not really 9 to 5. He calls you as soon as you get home, and then you're doing work in the evening. And it's Monday through Thursday, you're doing that. And now it's a mess. You're working so many more hours than you originally thought it would be. Now you resent your job and you're ready to quit and you're too afraid to have this conversation, right? So that's an example of like, wow, your people pleasing has gone too far. You need to stand up for yourself now and have a conversation
Mhm.
with your boss and talk about, hey, I want to work here, but now you've taken advantage of my kindness. And now I need some boundaries around my work hours. How can we talk
Mhm.
about that? So I hope that answers the listener's question a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to dive into with that. When I first saw this listener question too, it made me think a lot about how I often find myself when I'm in situations with people. If I'm with someone where they're like, "Oh, well, what do you want to do?" And my default is like, "Whatever you want to do." I've noticed this pattern of I am much more comfortable leaning into figuring out what someone else wants versus leaning into figuring
Mm,
out what I actually want,
I love
you
that.
know? Yeah, and so that's been a constant practice for me is like tapping in and learning how to listen to like what do I actually want right now because my default mode for so long has just been like I'm assessing the people around me, trying to figure out their needs to make sure their needs are met, not even tuning into my own. So
Yeah,
that's where I think mindfulness has been really key for me is just like taking a moment, slowing it down, listening and embodying for me what's actually there.
that's such
And
a
then
good point.
yeah, is that something you see in people often or?
Yeah, I mean, I just love how you gave such a solid example. Like, what do you want to eat for dinner tonight? And it's about it you
Mhm,
pick, right? Like,
mhm,
what time should we leave in the morning to go on our trip? Doesn't matter what's best for you. Like, the default
mhm,
is always what works for you, what works for you. And then they decide, and we may be too afraid to actually verbalize, well, I'd rather leave at this time, or I kind of want this for
mhm.
dinner tonight. And these are little examples, right? But they happen so much that it becomes problematic. All of a sudden, we're not making any decisions.
Mhm. Exactly, and I've found too that it'll be, like, people that I know are, like, supportive of me. It would be, like, in a situation with I'd be so uncomfortable making anything inconvenient for someone, even if it's not even inconvenient. Like, it would be, like, with my roommate who I've lived with forever and, no issues there. And it'd be like, "Man, I'm out of lettuce, and I really wanna borrow some of hers, but I don't even, like, wanna, like, text to ask that, so I'd rather just figure out another solution for myself." And it became a practice of, like, "Okay, this is a moment where I notice, like, I don't wanna do that thing because I'd rather make myself go out of my way to do something versus, like, telling someone I need something as small as a handful of lettuce," you know? So letting those be my scaffolding to build up of like, okay, this is a relationship that I know is safe, that I know is supportive. This is a really small thing that like she's not even think twice about. So like those were my moments of practicing like I'm gonna name my need right now and practicing those needs getting being met and then like that can build and build. So when there's other things it feels less overwhelming to name your need. But I think
Such
you
good
really have to meet
advice.
yourself where you're at. Yeah.
Such good
Think the
advice.
baby steps go a long way when it comes to that.
For sure. For sure. And you're bringing up like the mindfulness check in. Like, what am I feeling right now? What is this need that I want to be met that's triggering me or I'm having a reaction to, which makes me think of like one of the best ways to try and overcome people pleasing is paying attention to your thought patterns that are involved with these behaviors of avoidance, right? there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of what we call in psychology cognitive distortion. They're really like these thinking traps. And there's a lot of the should, the must, I ought to. We personalize things. We kind of jump to a conclusion without enough evidence. And with a lot of people pleasing thoughts and behaviors, we're jumping to a conclusion that if I say this or express my need, this person will be disappointed, or this person will reject me, this person will abandon me, this person will fight with me, this person, blah, blah, blah. And the reality is, like, probably not. Like, that person might just say, yeah, take my lettuce and not think anything
Mm-hmm.
of it. Right.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of mental work the people pleaser has going on that we need to slow down with the mindfulness and do some thought checking. All right. That's even
Mm-hmm.
helpful. Am I not even accurate? Is the way I'm thinking even reality based?
I
Or is it
had a moment with my husband the other night. We were at like a baby shower or something, and had been sitting with someone else, and then I was talking to him, but I'd left my drink, and I was like, oh, like I leaned into him and was like, man, like, is it bad if I go and reach over to get my drink and then I'm not talking to them anymore? And he was just like, I have never met anyone who overthinks as much as that. And it's like, oh yeah, these are good checks. Like it's okay. You can get your drink.
you can get your drink? It's
Yeah, like
so
you don't have to
true.
feel rude about that. It's
Oh yeah.
okay.
Oh yeah. It's so funny. And like my husband, I always joke like I'm the people pleaser and he doesn't appease anybody. And that's something that
Mhm.
maybe makes us a good fit, right? He's able to set boundaries so much better than me, the trained therapist, is able to do. Like it just
Mhm.
came natural to him to be able to do things like that. And he often is like the default of, really, can you set this boundary on our behalf? But, I should probably really practice it. But it's so true. Sometimes people pleasers partner up with people that are more assertive and able to set boundaries a lot better or get their needs met a lot easier.
Definitely. So as we start to talk about boundaries, I feel like we've kind of like dabbled in this. But how do you work with people to start establishing boundaries and kind of dealing with that initial discomfort of like now we're able to notice like okay, this pattern might be unhealthy for me with this point. I need to start to adjust. Where do we start and how do we deal with like the uneasiness that can come with that?
Totally. And I think boundary setting is another great way besides the thought challenging to help with people pleasing because people pleasers tend to have a little bit more elusive boundaries, right? We can think of boundaries as rigid or loose or a little flexible. Like there's different ways to describe it, but the people pleaser tends to be kind of loose because the setting the boundary leads to fear that the person will be disappointed with my boundary, right? So we want the people pleaser to start
Mm.
practicing setting more boundaries. So it really feels uncomfortable to start this if you're someone that's the people pleaser, because you're not used to doing it. But just because it's uncomfortable doesn't mean it's bad for you. That it's a good discomfort for you to go through.
Mhm.
I feel like boundary setting, we've really simplified online, but it's truly so complicated. And we want to imagine a boundary being this imaginary line that separates me from you, right? People have physical boundaries, which is a little bit more easily understood, but we also have these emotional boundaries, relationship boundaries, boundaries with our time and energy, our needs, our responsibilities from others. And our boundaries also tell other people how they can treat us and send a message about like what's really acceptable for us and what is. So people pleasers tend to be burnt out and they've ignored their boundary line somewhere, and it's usually with time, energy, or resources, right? So
Mhm.
in order to start setting boundaries, we need to get very clear, going back to the values, right? Like, what are your current values right now? And that clarity can help you guide your decisions around how you're spending your time, what you're agreeing to do, what your priorities are, who are the people in your life that should take up space. Um, and one way I try and challenge this in session is asking my client, like, do you value other people's comfort level over your own? And that sits with
Mhm.
people for a while because that's the truth. When we are people pleasing, we're saying, I value their comfort level and their happiness over what I need right now to be happy and comfortable. And you can't live a life that way. We need to value and honor our needs and what's truly good for us. So we want to challenge that over and over again. Um, like, what is the priority to you right now? And often we're stuck with decisions like, wow, I really value this thing and that thing. It feels impossible to make this decision. And that's real. That's life. There are so many situations where both values are being held, like friendship versus your husband, right? Oh, you value both of them, but now you have to pick one in this situation, right? Or let's say you have children, right? I have two little kids. Like, do I value her well-being right now or his well-being? How do I maintain two? Like, one's hitting the other, and how do I stop this
Mm-hmm.
fight? Right? It's like constantly trying to assess that. But anyway, so when we get clear on like what we're valuing, and I have a lot of exercises I do with clients that have like a bunch of like 100 values already laid out. You're circling the ones that fit for you right now. We're ranking how important they are to you. That just gives you some clarity. Then you can set a boundary with the time that you spend with other people, your resources, what you're saying yes to. So, for example, I'll just use myself as a model. Um, I'm a working, and I love my career, but I also love time spent with my kids. And one of my biggest values is present. So when I'm working with my clients, I am 100% focused on them, right? Like if it's in person or telehealth, how dare I check an email on a telehealth session? I would never do that, right? I'm a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm 100% focused and present with you, actively listening, right? And but then when I go home, I want to do the same for my kids, right? I want to be 100% present with them. And how dare I then check an email while I'm playing with magnet tiles, right? In a
Mm-hmm.
perfect world, we can do that 24/7. It's not a perfect world, right? Sometimes I have a client crisis where I do have to step outside my home to manage blah, 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 right?
Mm-hmm.
Or vice versa. Maybe I am in a therapy session with a client, but I'm like, I have a really important doctor that has to call me, that I have to step out for 5 minutes. Can you stay another 5 minutes if this call comes up? Blah, blah, blah. Right. So the value of being present has guided my boundaries, right? At work, I have boundaries to be present at work. And at home, I have boundaries put in place to be present at home. Does that make sense?
I think so. So, is what you're saying is that boundaries can be fluid, and that's like not
Yeah.
necessarily a bad thing as long as they're in alignment with your values. And by
Yeah.
using the values as the base, the boundaries can kind of meld around that from moment to moment.
Exactly. And listen, there's going to be some very rigid values people have. I mean, rigid
Hmm.
boundaries people have, like, I will not allow you to physically harm me, right? These are
Yes.
easier ones, right? People have
Yes.
very rigid, strict boundaries, as we should. But then there's other boundaries that can be a little bit flexible. But knowing what you value can help set up the boundaries that you need. And when we are in alignment with that, it's easier to set the boundary because you know it's coming from a place of alignment. And so
Hmm.
it's a little easier to talk to someone and say no when we're saying no out of our value system of what we value right then and there. So it's hard to do. Like, I always recommend, like, we start slow, right? Like, what's
Hmm.
one small thing that's kind of insignificant, but will give you good practice to set a boundary around? And it could be with
Hmm.
yourself or another person. And once you're consistent with practicing that, let's try a different boundary to set. And we want to slowly build on it.
Yeah, I love that. I think for me, a huge starting point was setting boundaries with myself, of being like, these are my non negotiables of ways I'm going to care for myself every day so that I can show up and not hit that resentment and burnout. And getting like really clear on that and really practiced in that. So then, if I wasn't at a point where I could communicate my needs as much as I wanted to, it was like I've taken care of my container enough to be in this space, and I've like done that base first. Like I put my oxygen mask on first, and then it's built and built. But I remember there, I mean, even sometimes now I probably still do it, but there was certainly a point where like I would want to go on a run or meditate or do something, but like I knew someone else wanted me to do something else, and I would, instead of saying like, no, I need to do this for myself because I thought it was like selfish, I would like make up another reason I couldn't be there or something or other. But
Right.
versus I think it's important to view someone once told me of thinking of it as selfish with a capital S, and it's like not a bad thing to be selfish
Mhm,
sometimes. There's
mhm.
a beauty to it and a it's like a radical compassion and radical acceptance to be like, no, this is what I need right now. I need to tend to me on this very baseline human level of having my basic needs met. Then I can show up and be a human with you and engage with you. But if I don't do that
Exactly.
first, I can't do the rest. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, correct trying to work on the people pleasing and setting boundaries is actually protective of the relationships we have because as you were saying before, like you could end up ghosting and cutting someone out.
Mhm.
But if you're practicing like, oh, I want to speak up and get my needs met or balance or have a conversation or communicate of like what works for both of us, then you're actually feeding and nurturing this relationship and sustaining it longer than the avoidance and like cutting it off or running the other way.
Mhm. And I think there might be a double-edged sword to this one too, particularly in, family dynamics and relationships you've had with people for a long time when you start to make that shift of my default mode isn't just going to be people pleasing. I'm not just going to agree and do what you want me to do all the time the way you're used to. I think that's really hard for the relationships at first. And
Yeah.
some forever, some may never totally adjust to it and that's information. Um but in my experience it's almost been like there's like an earthquake in the relationship and like the foundation, the soil, it's like gotta get broken up to get rearranged to settle into this new dynamic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And sometimes the family members or the friendships will act out and trying to suck you back into the way you were before to maintain that homeostasis of the relationship, of that predictability, that certainty of, oh, well, this person
Mhm.
always does things this way. But you're absolutely right. Some relationships can adapt to those new boundaries and others may not. But it's at the end of the day, you're going to be feeling better. This alleviates the anxiety, the guilt, the burnout for you.
And maybe on a level you're not going to be feeling better too because as a people pleaser it's like when, oh, like you're mad at me now, like I my system does not know how to deal with that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
having to learn how to be okay with that discomfort because I think maybe this is where your
absolutely.
values check comes back in. It's like
Mhm.
there's some serious discomfort that I'm feeling right now, but I'm checking into like my core value, not maybe this like ego that's in my head telling me that I need to do this to be loved.
Exactly. You hit it right there, right? And whenever there's guilt, we want to check like, did make a decision out of alignment with something I value? And most of the time, you're working on yourself. You're trying to make decisions out of your values and things aren't aligned with you. So the guilt can be irrational and it's just tolerating like, oh, I feel so uneasy that this person's mad at me or I disappointed them or I said no. But you get through that. And that's the growth,
Hmm.
getting out of the comfort zone.
Yeah. And just that learning how to be with discomfort, I just think is like maybe some of the medicine of people
Mhm.
pleasing. Like we just have to learn how to be with it. We have to learn how to be with the discomfort of knowing what you actually want and feeling worthy of that enough to name it. And the discomfort that arises when you don't please everyone because you can never, you won't always. And it's more important that you're like tapping into your values and honoring your authenticity. Um and I was thinking about this when we were talking about families too. This is maybe a way we can have a bit more compassion in these like more lifelong relationships we've had when they don't handle our new boundaries well. And like that's okay. Like if like I think something I've really had to learn is I am not responsible for how you receive my boundaries. And like
Yeah.
I'm not responsible for caring for you in that. Like that one's
Yeah.
on you. But I can have compassion, especially in like a family system where like we've all operated in this way to survive. This is how we have
Yeah.
made it. This is how we have formed. So when there is a disruption, it makes a lot of sense for people to like want to meld it back to the way it was because that's what felt safe. to them, even if it was dysfunctional or not supportive. Um, and with healthy communication and like a lot of time and practice, it can remold. But I think it can be helpful from the people pleasing end to kind of see it as like maybe it's not about me, which often I think that's like another secret for people pleasers is like it's actually not about you as much as you
Yeah.
think it is.
Absolutely. I love that you brought that in, the compassion part. And I think what might feel good is like the people pleaser being able to call it out, like, hey, mom, like, I know I normally do this every Wednesday for you. I'm just making something up, but you know what?
Mhm.
I can't anymore. And I know that's like so disappointing for you. But but this is what it is going forward. I understand if you feel a certain way about it, right? And giving the other person the opportunity to react. They're going to react and they're going to react in a way
Mhm.
that's uncomfortable. And that's that tolerance and validating that person. Like, yeah, mom, I see why you're upset about this change, but I need to make
Mhm.
this change or whoever we're setting that boundary with.
Yeah.
And that compassion is kind of reasonable. Yeah, you are changing and people don't like change, so they're going to react to it.
Mhm. I'm thinking of it right now as my sister and brother-in-law are like new parents. They just seem like total rock star parents. And when their kid doesn't get what he wants sometimes, they don't like just give it to him. They just like look at him and they're like, it's okay to be upset, buddy. Like, it's okay to feel
Yeah.
sad. It's okay to feel frustrated. And I think it's kind of like repeating that to yourself sometimes or like mentally saying that to the other person or verbally saying it like, it's
Yeah.
okay to be frustrated by that. Like, I'm not gonna change the boundary, but that's okay that you
Yeah.
feel that way.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's also making me think, so there's a modality in therapy called internal family systems. And it's kind of like,
Love internal family
okay, so
systems.
you know that. So there's the parts of ourselves. So the people pleaser might have a part called the pleaser, right? And so the pleaser has probably made a lot of decisions for them in their life that they've benefited from. And now if they're working on this, they might have to tell the pleaser and themselves, like, you're so well intentioned. I know you have my benefit in mind. Thank you for being here, but I need you to step back a little bit, pleaser, right? Or when you set a boundary and you're met with resistance, the pleaser in you are be like, oh, just change it back. Just change the boundary back. Let's make
Mhm.
this person more comfortable. Like, well, I can't take this discomfort. That's when you literally in your head talk to the pleaser part of you, like, pleaser, I know this is uncomfortable for you, but it's gonna be okay. We can get through this. Kind of like talking to the
Mhm.
toddler about the frustration.
Yeah. I think it's so helpful to just be able to view the different parts and just, like, imagine yourself self-soothing in that way and just, like, being as compassionate to all those parts and, like, none of them are bad. They just are there. They're not always doing
Yeah.
good things, but the core of it
Yep.
isn't.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you know much about the Enneagram at all?
I don't, and I know like it sounds amazing and I hear a lot about it, but I don't know much about it.
Yeah, totally good. I was gonna see if there was a relation in that at all, but
Number and people pleasing, that'd be interesting.
yeah, yeah. Um, taking a moment to regroup regroup my brain because I let it get scattered. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think that this was all so helpful. I tend to like to leave listeners with one small step they can start to take after these conversations. So, do you have one small step you would advise someone take today to, if they identify with people pleasing, how can they work towards stepping out of that pattern?
I would say think about one thing you have been resenting lately. And an obligation you agreed to do, or a chore you took on, or an assignment, or like something that you've been really resenting, a workout or a work commitment, who knows, whatever it is. And let's use that as an opportunity to set a boundary. And that might say, telling your friend, you know what, I agreed to bring the balloons for your bridal shower, just making something up. But you know, that day it's gonna be really difficult for me to actually do it. And I keep thinking about this. It's better if someone else can take that task on and I'm happy to do blah, blah, blah. right? Like you kind of trade it out. Or
Mhm.
it's, I work every day till 6 o'clock. I told this client that I would see them at this time. Really, I resent this time. I need to talk to this client about a different time that we can be meeting, right? So one thing you're resenting that you can set a boundary with and use your affirmations like, I can do this. I know this is uncomfortable. I can tolerate how uncomfortable this is. It's not going to be as bad as I think it is. Let me just try this now. Let me attempt this. So that would be your homework, listener, to pick one thing you're resenting, identify how to express that resentment in the most kind, compassionate way, and set a new boundary or say no or honor your own need in that situation.
Yeah, I love that. And I definitely recommend like starting small with that and then
Oh, yeah.
building. Like, don't start with your biggest thing. Start small and then you'll feel better and want to do it again.
Don't quit your job tomorrow. Let's pick
Yeah.
something else that we can do. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. This is such an important topic, and I really think it's going to be supportive for so many people listening. For those who are listening, do you mind sharing how we can support you and the work that you're doing in the world?
Absolutely. So everything is on my website, carinocounseling.com. That's where you can find all my services. I'm a therapist in New York. So if you live in New York, we can do virtual therapy. If you're outside New York, I do anxiety coaching. I also have a podcast called Thoughts from the Couch that focuses a lot on anxiety management, relationships, people pleasing, and perfectionism. I also have a fun quiz called Which Type of People Pleaser Are You? Which, if you
Mm.
take it, you get assigned one of five like archetypes that I've come across in my work. And you'll get an email of that archetype and some of the things that that archetype struggles with. So I can definitely give you that link as well for show notes.
Awesome. I'll put all the links to Justine's things in the show notes. I definitely recommend listening to Thoughts from the Couch. There's so many good conversations on there as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Holly, for having me.
So, if you haven't already heard, there is a new kid on the block called the How the Wise One Grows Dream Team. And this team is a group of listeners, could be you, who support the podcast every month. So, if this podcast has been impactful in your life in any way, consider joining the Dream Team for as little as $3 a month, and you can help all the podcast dreams come true. And you can also help support this podcast by sharing an episode you love with a friend and giving us a review on your favorite streaming platform.